The loss of a loved one will result in bereavement, grief, and mourning. So these are very different terms, though many people use them interchangeably. Bereavement refers to the state or condition caused by loss through death. So when a person dies in your life, that position they occupied in your family, that position they occupied at your place of work perhaps, that place is now vacant. So you have like a vacancy, in a manner of speaking, where that person used to be. Then the next one, grief, that refers to the emotions, basically. Like the sorrow, the hurt, the anger, the guilt, confusion, and the other feelings that arise after suffering a loss, which can be highly variable. So an easy way to keep these separate is to think of grief as the emotional reaction, whereas bereavement is the physical condition. So you suffer a physical loss of a thing, in this case a person, and the emotional reaction is the grief. So we have the physical and the emotional, and then the third part to this would be mourning, which is the way in which grief is expressed, which is largely based on culture. So this is the behavioral part. So if you suffer bereavement, you've suffered this physical loss of an individual, you're going to have an emotional reaction in the form of grief, which is dealt with through a behavioral response that we call mourning. So how a person mourns, as I mentioned, is largely based on their culture. But the amount of grief the person feels and exactly how that grief manifests is highly variable from individual to individual. But one thing that's common across all cases of dealing with this kind of grief is that it will involve a reorganization of your life. You're going to have to adapt to this physical loss of a loved one. So this is best thought of as like an active process that involves, first of all, acknowledging that the loss is real. This person has actually passed on. Also, you need to work through those negative emotions, that emotional turmoil. You need to adjust to this new environment you find yourself in. I'm not saying you need to fill the vacancy, so to speak, but you need to somehow adapt. You can't continue to go about normal business if that person played a very important role in your life. And then the fourth thing that you need to do in this active grieving process is to move on. You need to loosen your ties with the deceased. Now, I'm not saying that you need to put them entirely in the past. In fact, most people don't. I'm just saying you need to accept the fact that your relationship with this individual is now very different. And you need to kind of relax those ties, in a manner of speaking. But as I've already said a couple times, it's pretty variable from individual to individual how they do this and how long it takes and how extreme of emotions they experience. It's a highly personal process, and what might work for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. Most people will go through this process in at least about a year. 1 year seems to be like the minimum amount of time for a person to go through the grief process, but it could be much longer. The best thing you could do for somebody who is grieving is to just let them have that time. Express to them that you're there to help them if they need support in some way, but you just need to give them time. So, yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into this, but some of these factors can be predicted fairly accurately, like how big of an impact they're going to make, such as how the person died. The manner of death, the cause of death, can easily be used to predict how much grief it will cause. Like if it's a violent, sudden, traumatic death, then that's going to produce a lot more grief than if it was a slow and peaceful death. Another big factor is the individual's personality. So how you feel about death, like you're how optimistic you are, how emotionally stable you are, like all these also are major predictors. Another one is your religiosity. So what your religious beliefs are and how strongly you feel about those beliefs. Another one is your age. I mentioned in a previous video that as a person gets older, they have less death anxiety. So when people around them die, it upsets them, obviously, but they come to expect it and they are better able at handling it. Another one is gender. I mentioned in a previous video that men and women view death and have fear of death in different ways. Like women are going to be a lot more afraid of causing problems when they die, for example. Another thing is income. Like if a person's death puts a huge financial burden on you or your family, then it's obviously going to cause a lot more distress as a result. And then the last big predictor that we can look at is the quality of your interpersonal relationships. In other words, do you have a good social support network? Do you have a lot of friends and family that could be there for you in this time of need? So just to give you one example, if a person does have some time before they die, if their trajectory towards death is relatively slow, then that will allow you to experience what we call anticipatory grief. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's grief that's experienced while the person is still alive, but is expected to die. And if you go through this period of anticipatory grief, and then the person dies after that, you're not going to grieve as much because you've already dealt with a lot of those emotions. You've already dealt with a lot of those problems while they were still alive. So it can be very beneficial if the individual doesn't have a sudden death for you to just be able to work through those feelings with them while they're still around. Now, there's different degrees of these emotional reactions that we call grief. Normal grief reactions involve things like just feeling sad, being in a degree of denial, being angry, being lonely, being guilty. And yeah, there's a lot of variability there. And the ability to deal effectively with these emotions involves what we call grief work. Grief work is just the term we use to describe the psychological side to coming to terms with being bereaved. And as I mentioned previously, people just need time, and people need space. You need to let them deal with these emotions. And these emotions that they're going through basically take in the form of like 5 different themes of grief. And this comes from research done by Muller and Thompson. So grief work can be broken down into these 5 different themes. So first of all, people, when they're engaged in grief work, they're going to be doing a lot of coping. They're going to be going to do various things and maybe engaging in various behaviors just to help them deal with that loss, to manage those negative emotions. Some people do less, healthy things like start drinking more often, or doing a lot of risky behaviors or something like that. But coping doesn't necessarily need to be problematic like that. Everybody has their own methods of coping, and that's just one of the themes of grief work. Another theme is affect. So this is where the person focuses on how they react emotionally to the death and things that trigger those emotions. Like they'll start, looking for things that trigger these upsetting feelings, these upsetting memories, and try to eliminate those triggers. The third theme of grief work is change. So this is where the person reflects on how their life has changed and who they could become now that the person has gone. Obviously, they have to adapt to this bereavement, so they will have to grow in some way. The fourth theme of grief work is narrative. So this is where they talk about the deceased, telling stories about the deceased. It's, in a manner of speaking, it's like doing a life review for the person who has passed on. And this does help you to get just a better context and understanding of what your relationship was like with that person. And then the fifth and final theme of grief work is relationship, where the kind of person the deceased was and the survivor's ties with him or her are evaluated. As I mentioned previously, when a person is working through grief, they have to loosen those ties, but they don't necessarily have to sever them. In a lot of cultures, it's quite normal to maintain a relationship of some kind with the deceased through, like, ancestor worship, for example. So those are the ways that people work through that grief. And when we look at how people express these feelings, like these outward expressions, we see that there's a lot of variability in terms of culture and ethnicity, actually. Like Latino men, for example, they are much more likely to express their grief than European American men. They're just more in touch with their emotions in that regard. And while there are some interesting cultural differences like that, a lot of them are based largely on things like religious belief, for example. Like those cultures that practice ancestor worship, it's commonly believed that the ancestors do in fact hear them and will visit them from time to time and have conversations with them. So it is in many regards a real, cooperative relationship. Now, there's been a lot of research on, a lot of competing theories as to how people cope with their grief. And one more popular one is called the 4-component model. So the 4 components of this model are the context of the loss, so whether the death was expected or a surprise. The second one is continuation of subjective meaning associated with loss, so dealing with existential issues as a result of this loss, like thinking about your own existence, your own possible death. The third one is changing representations of the lost relationship over time. And the fourth is coping and emotion regulation processes. This is where the grieving person can try to make some meaning from the loss. Avoiding the problem can make it worse. Like, it's important that you focus on what you have lost and try to deal with it in as effective way as you can. But that's just one potential idea. It has gotten a lot of support from the research, but there are other ideas. Like, there's an alternative view called the grief work as rumination hypothesis, which argues that grief processing, focusing on your grief and trying to work through your grief by doing that, grief work, this is not necessary and can actually be counterproductive. A grief processing can increase your distress in the form of rumination. So, in other words, if you spend all your time just thinking about your feelings and thinking about the lost loved one, it could develop into an obsession, basically. Another popular idea from the research is called the dual process model, or DPM. So this is a view of coping with bereavement that integrates loss-oriented stressors and restoration-oriented stressors. So when I mention loss-oriented stressors, I mean like stressors related to the loss itself, like dealing with the grief work. When you have lost a loved one, you're going to be feeling all these negative, upsetting feelings, and you have to deal with it. So that's what that's about. And then the restoration-oriented stressors refer to the actions that you have to take in order to get your life back into balance. Stressors that are present when adapting to your new life situation, such as finding and developing new relationships and engaging in new activities now that this person is gone. And according to the research, this is a dynamic process. So people are going to cycle back and forth between these two processes, trying to find a balance. So that just means, they'll be focusing on the emotions and trying to deal with those emotions and overcome those emotions while simultaneously trying to alter their situation and, completely change the context. Like, instead of just sitting around thinking about the loved one, they're going to spend a little time with that, and then they'll go out to try to meet somebody new. So they alternate between these two in a back and forth process until they find some satisfaction. But for some individuals, as I mentioned earlier, dealing with grief and dealing with issues of death, this can become problematic. It can actually turn into a disorder. Now, there's still a lot of debate amongst psychiatrists and psychotherapists as to whether or not grief disorder is an actual thing that we should put in the DSM. You know, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is always evolving. But the idea of complicated or prolonged grief disorder is that it's this expression of grief that is distinguished from normal depression and from normal grief in terms of two kinds of symptoms: separation distress and traumatic distress. And experiencing this kind of a grief disorder seems to be most likely with the loss of a child, especially a young child. So young adults who suffer that kind of loss, they are very likely to show the following symptoms. So as I mentioned, they come in two categories: separation distress, which involves being preoccupied with the deceased to the point that it interferes with everyday functioning and having upsetting memories of the deceased, longing and searching for the deceased, and just overall feeling isolated. And then there's traumatic distress, which refers to a series of symptoms including being in disbelief about this individual's death, mistrusting others, feeling a lot of anger, and becoming detached from others, feeling shocked, and experiencing the physical presence of the deceased. So what these symptoms are showing us is that this person is basically, in a manner, if you actually look at the DSM and you read about mental disorders, this sounds a lot like psychosis. The person has psychotic symptoms. They're experiencing delusions and hallucinations. They're becoming detached from reality. They're becoming increasingly hostile and alienated from friends and family. So that's why we consider this a disorder. This is why we consider this different from normal grief, because the person is taking it to the extreme, so extreme that they're just detaching from reality.